recording.
Oh, I don't. Oh, okay.
Okay, you should all see that. So good morning to the recording and to all of those who are watching it on the recording, as well as those who are live today. We're going to complete that unit we had. We started on whistleblowing, and then as I think I've mentioned, I'm using a book called Modern Responser by Rabbi Pamela Barmash. It's to take some different units. I'm not going through the book through every chapter that she has. I'm skipping around a little bit because I find some topics a little bit more interesting. We may go back to some of the other ones after we talk about whistleblowing. I really was struck by the material she has about a sex offender in the synagogue, which I think has quite immediate relevance. Some of the material she has on business practices, we've sort of spoken about. We may go back to it at some point. It has some interesting questions about competition, but that's for some other time. Okay, so what we're going to do today is continue. And let me get the screen share. Okay, does everybody see that? Okay, this share is a good size. And we had started this unit. We got about halfway, a little bit more than halfway through this question of whistleblowing. And the Teshuvah was written by a rabbi who actually had been in the business world. And he mentions in his Teshuvah that he'd had a situation where he had to make a decision about whistleblowing. And excuse me, just to quickly review, to what extent does an employee have an obligation to report wrongdoing on the part of his or her employer? And we saw that he was talking about it. There were many examples, Enron, the Ford Pintos. The first topic he chose to talk about was the question of Lashon Hara, because there is a very strong and long history in Jewish ethical thinking about how we speak, about the use of language. And he pointed out that there are some very specific rules when we talk about others that we need to be sure that we follow to be ethical. And he spoke about them, and we'll get back to them towards the end. How is there a responsibility to rebuke? And generally, he has said there is a responsibility to rebuke, but he had that qualification, which was if one superior was not responsive to rebuke. We know that sometimes you work in a corporate or even a nonprofit structure where you are immediate superior doesn't care or doesn't want to listen or is in on it, shall we say, okay? So the next question is whether an employee is required to notify, such as in other words, do you go over somebody's head, in the classic terms? And then the question is, okay, well, in one case, he's going to say, oh, do you go over somebody's head if you're not getting a response? If there's a case of pikuach nefesh, life is endangered. That was that case with the Ford Pinto. As you may recall, the Ford Motor Company decided it was cheaper to have the defect continue and pay off the lawsuits than pay the money to fix the problem. All right. So that unfortunately occurred. And his point is that if a life is endangered, then you definitely go over the head. Let's go down to where we were. In cases of pikuach nefesh, there is a positive requirement to report employee wrongdoing, even if it will come at substantial financial cost to the person reporting it, such as
being fired,
having a black mark in your, having no future in the company, being demoted. There could be significant financial cost to that. So that's where we were up to last time, to issue 4. Now, issue 4, it gets a little bit more complex. 1 second, I just want to get my notes. Second. Okay, so issue four is more complicated. What about financial loss? So what might be some of the issues with financial loss? If you're a whistleblower, what might your considerations be? Anyone suggests
You
what they might?
you lose your job.
Okay, you might lose your job. Okay, so in other words, there is a significant there. If there's a problem, well, what if it's not you're losing your job? What if it's not quite that serious? Is there a threshold? They're cheating and it's $1,000, you know. It's a big corporation. They're making accounting you know, a play, they're putting something in accounting which shouldn't go there, and it's not that much money, but it's definitely wrong. Should you report it? Any suggestion? Yeah, Carol, what should you do?
I think he makes a distinction between a small amount of money and a very large amount of money.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because you may recall, let's go back, way back to our ethical reasoning. And one ethical system is there is a strict set of rules and you always follow the strict set of rules, right? That we saw, for example, you're telling if telling the truth is always what you have to do, then and the classic example, somebody runs into your house and says, somebody's trying to kill me. And then a few minutes later, a guy with a gun comes up to you and says, where'd the guy go? Well, if you have to tell the truth, you have to say, oh, he's in my house. But there's another set of ethical rules that say, wait a second, it may depend on the consequences, right? So is there an absolute rule? You have to report any wrongdoing, right? Which with pikuach nefesh, we would apply. There's an absolute rule. But with finances, is there an absolute rule or a practical rule? Are we concerned about, well, what is the consequence versus, a couple $100, somebody, is fooling around with the books. So should it be an absolute? So notice that we're pointing out that perhaps there's more than one ethical principle that should be applied in these cases. Okay. So, of course, you can argue that with the pikuach nefesh, it's also a question of consequence because it's consequences of losing life, but it also tends more towards the absolute rule. So what do we do with financial law? Is there an absolute rule or is it a practical rule? Okay. Consequential ethics, shall we say. So, excuse me. Well, we certainly know about Enron. Enron is trying to make a comeback. I just heard somewhere Enron is trying to come back. I don't, WorldCom is, don't even remember. Okay. Misappropriation. There's another question of another country's intellectual property. What if you steal someone's invention and make money out of it? Creative accounting. This I'd never heard of. Silicon Valley, a young high-tech company, literally shipped bricks to claim they had made a shipment so they could record the revenue. See, we made a shipment. It wasn't what we were supposed to ship, but we just shipped a bunch of bricks. So that's obviously shows up on their reports that they did ship, that they did ship out. What they shipped out was not what they were supposed to. Okay. So if a person knows that the company is stealing from individuals or from another company, he knows that someone is being harmed. This could be seen as a case of finding a lost object, which the Torah instructs us to return with not just one, but two commandments. To return, literally, if you return a lost object, you are following a mitzvah, a technical term from the Torah. So you could say that when you have this type of corporate misconduct of stealing, that should be done. And it's also about misappropriation of intellectual property. That's a real question. Now, how you understand stealing of intellectual property it gets a little bit complicated, and he tries to point it out. If a person sees someone's electricity needlessly being wasted, he could surmise that the owner would turn it off if he was there, and if possible, a passerby should turn off the electricity. I once saw the faucet coming out of the side of a one of my neighbor's houses. I live in a condo development, and in this building there are 5 houses in the building. It's one building with 5 townhouses, and the water was coming out of the side of her. She has a faucet in building number 1, and the water was coming out of the faucet. I went over and I turned it off. Okay, is this so? So he's saying misappropriation of intellectual property is somewhat analogous. In both cases, there is a loss by the owner. The owner is unaware of the loss, and the object being lost is intangible. Same thing with the electricity or the water. It says that to do nothing in such a case, according to a rabbi, would be a transgression of both the obligation to return lost objects and the prohibition against turning eyes from your neighbor's lost object. Okay. The theft of IP is a little different. Or the water, the person who owns the accounts for the water or the electricity is going to have to pay. Whereas in the case if you steal somebody's invention, the owner is simply not collecting money that is due, but he does not have to pay something to a third party. But it's something that should not be done. Okay. So now he's going to talk about some very specific examples. A Jewish accountant who discovers that Reuven, by the way, when you read some of this material, there's Reuven and Shimon. That's John Doe. In other words, they don't want to name the name. So typically in Jewish sources, you talk about either Ploni ben Ploni, or Ploni Almoni, or Reuven and Shimon. Okay. Reuven, the head of this Jewish organization, is embezzling and cooking the books. The accountant warns Reuven that he will publicize the matter. The rabbi Gushulevitz ruled the accountant is allowed to publicize the matter to embarrass Reuven, despite the prohibition against embarrassing one's fellow, right? Embarrassing one's fellow is a serious matter in Jewish law. There is no other way to salvage the money because the accountant is a shomer sakir, a paid trustee. In other words, he has an obligation to the organization to see to it that the money is properly spent. So in other words, the treasurer of a nonprofit, even of a synagogue, unfortunately, there have been cases, and I could tell you of some where people have been stealing money from synagogues, and even though you're going to embarrass the person who did it, you have to do so. Okay. Even though there may be an obligation to save oneself from a loss if one can do so at no cost, one is not obligated to lose wages to save someone else's loss. Wow. This gets to this question of how much personal loss you would take. This is understood by some rabbis. One does not have to forego potential profits to return a lost item. This is in reference to whistleblowing, is that if the employee feared that reporting the loss would jeopardize his job, a potential loss not only of profits, but for his very livelihood, he would not be obligated to inform. What do you think of that ruling? Makes sense? Fair? Rini?
I'm sorry I was late, but I have 2 comments. One about the small amount of money. If someone gets away with taking a small amount of money, then they probably or likely might continue to do that, and it eventually becomes a large amount of money. If you get away with something, keep going. And the question you just asked about not being obligated to inform, if in case he loses his job, there should be, I guess there should be laws of protection so that he doesn't lose out financially because somebody is doing something wrong. On the other hand, maybe there are ways to do things anonymously. where someone is informed on, but the whistleblower remains anonymous, and that's, solves the problem.
That could potentially,
Could.
yes, it could.
Potentially, yes.
And it may or may not be possible. Yes, that would certainly be an ideal solution, but often, how does this anonymous source know what's going on? Well, let's see, there are 3 people in accounting who have access to this particular.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess that's true.
That sort of thing could be possible as well. So yes, ideally, anonymity might be a good solution, but that may not be a practical.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Any other comment about this? Here some rabbi said, if the loss would jeopardize his job, you would not be obligated to inform. Does not create some sort of an ethical quandary for this individual who is continuing to work for the organization, which he knows is doing things wrong. Is it trying to make notice in this case, the pragmatic consequential ethic is overriding the more absolute ethic, right? This is a real case of the pragmatics. However, he points out, there are those who might argue that based on the principle of yad foel yad ba'al habayit, the hand of the employee is like the hand of the employee, i.e., the employee is considered an extension of his employee. He should be forbidden to do anything that would cost his employer money, like reporting wrongdoing. To this, we would respond that this is true as long as the employer is operating within the bounds of the law. If the employer is engaged in deceptive or fraudulent practices, there is a requirement, quote, I just quoted that last Shabbat, midavar sheker tirchach, to keep far from a false manner. General statement within the Torah, it's in the book of Exodus, that one should not lie and not be a party to wrongdoing, and that this would override the employee's obligations towards the employer. So here we're seeing that we have some two different opinions as to what would be the proper thing to do, okay? And he also points out that there are things called non-disclosure agreements, which are very common today, where employees and employers can't go public with things that they see that happens while they're being employed. There's a large controversy about how much these non-disclosure agreements should be enforced. We typically see this in some cases, an agreement was reached between the employer and the employee, and the contents were not disclosed, right? You see that, and there's some real questions as to whether that's a good thing. Okay. Yeah, Tammy?
Yeah, what about the case of Boeing, where that man exposed the fact that they were not putting the right bolts in and they were sending planes out that were not properly fitted?
As I recall, he left the company.
Right. Yeah, I think they threw him. I don't remember if he was fired. I think he was fired.
Or did he
and
resign?
they claimed,
I don't know. I don't remember.
But he made
right.
60 minutes.
But there is also a question of pikuach nefesh, right? One could argue that clearly is endangering people's lives, right? The case of that door that flew off was just fortunate that someone could have been sucked out of the plane, but it was just fortunate that nobody happened to be sitting next to the door, as I recall. Is that correct? Yeah, but that was definitely endangering life. Now, it's true that there was a law in 2002 to provide protection. Whoever knowingly with intent to retaliate takes any action harmful to any person, including interference with the lawful employment or livelihood of any person, for providing to a law enforcement any truthful information. In other words, there is a law now that was passed in 2002 that is trying to protect whistleblowers, okay? It does not require every employee to report acts of wrongdoing. It just requires the employer not to retaliate, okay? So that is some protection to public corporations. However, if you're a nonprofit or governmental entity, you don't have any protection. This is just in the private sector. Okay.
on the other hand, Rabbi, who would want to, I mean, maybe a person would stay long enough to collect enough salary not to starve or anything, get kicked out of his home. But I can't imagine an employee wanting to stay at a company. So it's protecting the employee, but the work atmosphere would be terrible.
Yeah, but we don't know about, so an employee who may feel that he or she has no other job options. Say they're,
Oh, yes.
they're 60 years old. I hate to say this, but there is such a thing as age discrimination
There is.
in many parts of of our economy. Or they have a child in a private school who has learning disabilities and they need the money to pay for the tuition for the child in the private school, and the child's well-being is dependent upon this person having a well-paying job that provides for that, for some, or just to
That's
put a
great.
roof over their head.
So it sounds to me like those situations would be discouraging for whistleblowing, regardless of the Sarbanes-Oxley law.
Well,
It's
the law is supposed to
because
protect.
they
Yeah,
could
right.
make your life so miserable that you have to quit, or there are other ways to intimidate people other than firing them.
Right, and the law only is in the private sector. What if you're in the the nonprofit sector or in the government? So it is still an area where there are consequences to whistleblowing. Logically, however, since one is not obligated to injure oneself financially to save someone else's money, an important factor in the decision about whether or not to whistleblow is proportion. See, now he says, look, since you don't have to do this, he is adding now the issue of proportion, which means someone would not be required to endanger his livelihood to protect someone against a small loss. How do you define a small loss? That's quite relative, of course. On the other hand, in a case where the sums involved are large, what's the dividing line? Not clear. Of course, it's not clear. Yes, obviously some sums are large and some sums are small. Where that appears is not an easy question sometimes. And in some cases, the money involved can be staggering in the billions of dollars. While one might not be strictly obligated under halakha to report the wrongdoing, one who does so is praiseworthy. We are charged to be hayashar v'hatov be'enei Adonai, to do what is good and right in the eyes of the Lord. So what Rabbi, the author here, Rabbi, I'm blanking on his name. The author is saying that you might not be obligated, you should, and he's arguing proportionality is an issue. If one can report financial wrongdoing on the part of his employer without jeopardizing his own money or livelihood, you're obligated to do so. Well, that's pretty clear and obvious, okay? If there is a risk of substantial loss to the one reporting the wrongdoing, he is not strictly required to do so. You're not required to hurt yourself, but if the transgression is a major one, involving substantial fraud and potential loss. Again, we're not talking about pikuach nefesh, that we've already dealt with, not about lives. Substantial fraud and potential loss, it is merely entirely appropriate to go lifnim mishurat hadin, which is a Hebrew phrase translated typically as beyond the strict letter of the law, and report the wrongdoing. What do you think of that conclusion? Comment on his conclusion?
He's saying there's a limit. If he's stealing $5, it's okay. But if he's stealing $5,000, it's not okay.
Well, again, $5,000 to Boeing might not be a lot,
Right.
$5,000 to your to the Congregation B'nai Shalom Fairlawn Jewish Center, that's not an insignificant amount of money. So the questioner, he is adding proportionality, right? You're not obligated to do so to hurt yourself, to lose your job. And then he says, if it's, quote, large, it's a good thing to do, right? Is that a good conclusion? Can you think of a better one?
But he's not saying, even if it's a large amount, you're not really obligated, let's
Correct.
say.
You're not obligated, but it would be a good thing.
Even if it's a large amount.
The large amount, Jewish ethical teachings would promote your being a whistleblower, but you're not obligated to do so. Now, I would only say it would be very hard, and I imagine if you know, imagine yourself in that situation.
Yeah, sometimes it's better to just go get another job.
Assuming one can, correct.
Yeah.
Assuming one can.
Actually, my son had a situation like that. He was hired, he joined a doctor in practice, and the doctor was cheating on Medicare. And David knew that if he blew the whistle on this doctor, he would have a hard time getting another job. So he just quit and joined another practice.
Right. You know, I'm sorry, go ahead. Someone else had a comment? Well, that is, yeah, that's an interesting question because here, now that option, if it's a big amount, just leave. Which, you know, you don't want to be known as, oh yeah, he's the guy who he's the doctor who calls out other doctors. It's like, hey, think about other professions, police. Oh, he's the guy who rats on other policemen. He's his life's not going to be too good after he leaves the police force, you know. Or even imagine a situation where a clergy person said, you know, this congregation is cheating, it's stealing money. Do I just quit? Or do I call the authorities? Oh, he's the, you know, clergy person who called the authorities out on his congregation. I don't want to hire him. Yeah, Rini.
It's
And then
tricky
Charlie.
because in the case that Carol just cited, I get that. You know, I have left jobs not because it was unethical, but you know, you don't like the practices or whatever is going on. On the other hand, if someone is defrauding Medicare, that is not a small amount. And it affects really everybody because we all pay into that. At some point in our lives, when we're young, we pay in, and when we're older, we benefit. So that's, you know, pretty major. So it's very, I'm not saying, you know, that was the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying it's so complicated that it's very hard to find the right or wrong thing to do in those cases.
Okay, okay, Charlie, you were going to comment?
Yeah, my general concern is the unintended consequences of what you do as a whistleblower. That's not really talked about in this treatise or the judgment or whatever that Dr. Roth is talking. You know, what they call this this whole what's the word for it, that this treatise that we're talking. The judgment, the statement,
non-disclosure,
the judgment, the Dr. Rabbi Left's whole treatise, or I'm not, the word escapes me, but the unintended consequences of your actions. Of just being a whistleblower is fine, but what about the innocent people that may lose their jobs? Not your job, but what about the secretary, the assistant to the doctor, or the you know, there's a whole bunch of people involved within the operation that could lose their jobs when you blow the whistle.
well,
So you really have to think of what the collateral damage is with what you do before you do it.
Well, that certainly could be very true in many organizations, But note, Rabbi Leff does not, right? He does not consider in this teshuvah that question of collateral damage. He's
I
just
know. I think that's a failure on his part because when you blow the whistle, a lot of things can happen. You start the ball moving in a direction that may involve people who are totally innocent. The children, the rabbi's, I'm sorry, the doctor's family. Okay, I mean, people who, it's a very involved thing. It's not that simple to blow a whistle.
okay. Carol, go ahead.
And he makes it a little too easy.
I'm
I
sorry.
think.
Sima, did you want to say something? Then Sima, then Carol. Okay.
Charlie, you raised a really good point, but then all the other people that are being hurt if you don't say something. But the case that you started saying about police, it's like, look at the Floyd situation. I'm sure those officers wanted to tell him to get off of the guy's neck, and they were just too afraid because of the brotherhood of the policemen. And it's really sad. So everyone's afraid to tell someone what they're doing wrong or to tell on somebody. And in this case, it cost someone their life. So.
No, that's an issue.
Well,
Yes.
that's an extreme case, but you're right. I mean, so what happens after you blow the whistle gets beyond your control, and very often it goes in the wrong direction that could hurt people who are just innocent bystanders.
Okay. Carol, you were going to also comment?
What he says that there are other people involved in this practice. There are nurses. There was an accountant. There were other people who actually knew what was going on. They didn't say anything. Their jobs were at stake. But if the whistle was blown, they would also lose their jobs. And to me, I would question, was that deserved? Because they went along with this cheating. They
Also, or were they culpable? And they may have been even legally culpable.
Ability on their part.
Right? They could be prosecuted for hiding the fraud. Unfortunately, Medicare fraud is quite widespread. Happened to my brother-in-law. He actually once read one of these. This is not a bill. You get those, those of us on Medicare. We always get this is not a bill, right? How many? Oh my! How many do we get? How closely do we read them? Not very typical. I typically, oh, it's not a bill. Good. I'll stick it in the file. And in a couple of years, I'll shred it. So my brother-in-law gets one and he looks at it and he says, wait a second. I didn't have those tests. And he reported them. And they called him back for Medicare and thanked him because the doctor he had seen was billing Medicare for tests that he never had. So yeah, it's not uncommon.
So Rabbi, can I ask you a question? So if we have this dilemma, can we come to our rabbi to ask him what we should do?
You could. I will point out that we are seeing a lot of gray area here, right? As in often happens, what is, quote, a substantial loss, right? What is a substantial loss to an individual? He can't, nor should he say, okay, for a corporation that's gross profits are X to X, a substantial loss is X. For a small business whose gross profits are X to X, the substantial loss is B. And for a person who can't get another job, the loss is X. And, certainly your rabbi can help you think through these, but often in ethical dilemmas, there is a gray area, right? And what Rabbi Leff is pointing out is that there can be a gray area in this question of whistleblowing, and because he's thinking of it through a consequential ethical lens, right? That in these cases, it would be nice, not every case is Boeing in the door blowing off or the Ford Pinto. Yeah, Rini.
We actually had a case involving a rabbi a long time ago in our congregation before you came. And he was going to elderly congregants and telling them that his parents were ill and he needed money to help take care of them. And then he would go to the track.
Listen,
So-
yeah. I
So
mean,
they
that's
found that out, and of course they couldn't get the money back for the elderly congregants, but they fired him. So the consequences were all on him in that
Right.
case. They didn't
I mean,
give him a second chance. They just fired.
Right. And I've heard of synagogues, and I won't go into specifics, where there are individuals who are in charge of specific funds within the synagogue to
Right.
provide certain services to the synagogue who have embezzled money from those funds. I have heard of that as well.
That happened to us too.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, things are like that. But those are more obvious and simple, examples. When you find out, for example, that the rabbi was doing something wrong, there would be no question that there's an obligation to report it. But there, things, whistleblowing, as we see. Yes, there are a lot of clear black and white cases, but sometimes it's a little, what Rabbi Leff is saying, sometimes it can be a bit gray. And this issue of how the measure of how serious it is versus the consequences do have a role in determining what you do. We would like to live in a perfect society in which there were no personal consequences for whistleblowing, and the law tries to do that, but it's not entirely clear. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on this? This is, I think, is one of the most important of his conclusions when he tried to look through this. Any other comments on this?
Well,
Yeah,
there's some
Carol?
some societies where, Orthodox people beat their wives or abuse children and they hide it.
Believe me, non-Orthodox do it as
And
well.
right, everybody.
Let's not pretend that domestic abuse is something that continues to be, and sexual abuse is something that continues to be an issue in terms of, quote, whistleblowing and consequences. Right? You see cases where the person who brings the complaint wants to remain anonymous. You can understand that. That's a problem, though, right? Isn't it? Isn't there something going on in Congress today about that? Anyway, Carol, go ahead.
Would we consider whistleblowing if the cantor, the chazan of your synagogue, and this is something that happened to my parents, they were a Brown's Hotel in the Catskills, and the chazan of another synagogue was there with a woman who was not his wife. What is their obligation?
That's a good, that's a great, and we are certain that he was not just
They were together, sharing the room.
They were sharing the room. It was not his wife. That would seem to be a clear example of a sin, obviously. What would be the appropriate approach? Number
my
one,
parents were there with another couple. They discussed it and they did report it.
yeah, I'm going to say, first of all, be sure that you be certain that the information is correct. We're talking about Lashon, remember with Lashon Hara, sure it's correct. You have no, it's not that you don't like this chazan's voice. I don't like his voice, and now I got him, and yes, it would seem to me that would be something that should be reported to the appropriate authorities. Listen, it's as I said, there are some black and white situations, and Rabbi Leff makes it very clear. It's not always black and white. There can be some extenuating circumstances, and we deal with the ethic of consequences rather than the ethic of absolutes. That's what he's saying here. Okay. Okay, we're going to get to this ending. I'm not going to go through this. Does it make any difference if the CEO or ownership of either company is Jewish? The answer is no. I mean, we can read this, and it is true in Jewish history, non-Jews were often, more often than not, anti-Semitic or did not treat Jews well. And non-Jews were often, if you go back to ancient times, idolaters. We're not living in that society anymore. So, I mean, that's not a question that we even deal with. Rabbi Dorf says in his response on renting a synagogue facilities to Christian groups, there is a concept of Yoshar, doing what is right and good in the sight of the Lord. For us to treat Gentiles differently on such matters than we treat Jews would not be the right thing to do. I think it goes without saying. I mean, perhaps in certain more very, very right-wing traditional communities that might still exist, but that's something that is back in the past in Jewish life. Okay, so now we're up to his conclusions. All right. Many of the ethical situations are very complex, right? It's not always black and white. If figuring out the exact proper path under halakha at times seems a daunting task, it is good to remember that our tradition teaches that when we appear before the heavenly Bet Din, after the end of our lives, we're going to be asked to review our lives. And the first question is, Nasata v'natata be'emunah. Did you conduct your business affairs with integrity? That's a wonderful Talmudic statement. I've given sermons on that. You might think that the first question you get at the gates of Olam Haba is, did you go to Minyan? Did you pay your synagogue dues? Did you tell the truth? Did you not steal, right? Well, let's go down the 10 Commandments. Let's start with number 1. But no, the rabbis have a wonderful statement that you're accountable first, nasata v'natata be'emunah. Did you deal with your business, your monetary affairs with integrity? And when answering that question, it is not enough to say that you diligently follow the letter of the law, for we are taught that Jerusalem was destroyed because the inhabitants failed to be lifnim mishirat hadin. In other words, they failed to go beyond the minimum requirements of the law. It is sometimes easy to say, I'm just doing what the law requires of me. Goodbye, we're done. But sometimes that may be legally correct, but morally, there might be some questions about what you do. So he continues with this question about, it's similar to what we learned about with Lashon Hara, right? Be certain, right, that you're doing it, that there's constructive benefit, that there is a benefit, the stockholders, the general public, whatever. Don't report the harm if the wrongdoer is likely to be disproportionate to the noxiousness of the misconduct. The guy in the next desk to me is stealing pencils and taking them home. You might not want to blow the whistle on that. I don't. Pure intent, desire, should not be motivated by a desire for personal gain, and its accuracy. Don't exaggerate this. What is interestingly done is he's taken some of those questions about Lashon Hara, when you feel that you have to say something, that be very clear that you're doing so ethically. Okay, and here are his conclusions. Piskei halacha, legal conclusions. In any case of wrongdoing, there is an obligation to rebuke the person doing the wrong if, now here again, we have this qualification. It can be assumed there's a reasonable chance that the rebuke will be listened to, and the rebuke can be administered without substantial personal cost to the reporter. Notice there are a couple of sort of generalized hedges in this, but that is the conclusion he comes to. In cases of pikuach nefesh, okay, now, wait a second. Now it's not just somebody stealing pencils or cooking the books, but there's a certainty or substantial likelihood of loss of life if the information is withheld. One is obligated to report the information to appropriate authorities, even at substantial personal cost. You can lose your job. Well, you can lose your job, but people might not die. So that's again weighing, and we've seen again in many of our ethical discussions that there is a hierarchy of values about saving life. And finally, here, in cases of financial loss, that's the one we've been sort of discussing here. If wrongdoing can be reported at no cost to the reporter, there is a positive obligation to do so. That's easy. If wrongdoing would jeopardize the reporter's money or livelihood, there is no strict obligation to report wrongdoing. Okay. It is, however, appropriate to consider, and here's again, even with what you were talking about, Charlie, proportionality, right? What's the consequence? It is appropriate to demur from reporting minor wrongdoings that would have a major cost to the reporter. Okay, that seems, again, a logical question of consequence. On the other hand, in the event of major wrongdoing, and again, he can't define that precisely, nobody can. We know what let's put this, we know clearly what certain major wrongdoing is, but there can be gray areas. It is appropriate to go lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the requirements of the law, and report it even at substantial personal cost. Okay, that's his conclusions. Any, put them all up there. There they are. Any comment or final concern as we end this look at this teshuva? Okay. We should never be in that situation where we have to make that decision, but you hope that this at least gives, yes, are these guidelines in some ways kind of general? Yes, they are, because they have to be, because there's a difference between pikuach nefesh and stealing pencils, and consequences to the person who does the wrongdoing. So that's where we end up. All right. And Rainey?
I was just going to say, since I've joined this group, this is one of the trickiest one. And the trickiest isn't the word, but hardest to resolve. It's easier to talk about end of life issues because there's a certain not regularity, but there's certain things you can measure if someone's, not breathing. But here, there's so many factors involved. It's very tricky to know what the ethical solution or the ethical way to follow if you see something done wrong, how it works.
Oh yeah, again, a general rule we can have is that there are a lot of gray areas in ethical decision making.
Right.
Even when we take, and as I again, if we can grade Rabbi Leff at how well we think how good a job he's done. I think he's done a very good job in recognizing that there are some absolutes, and then there are some gray areas, and he can't tell you exactly what to do in every situation because of this issues of consequence to the reporter and the level of the wrongdoing, right? Because those can vary tremendously. Okay. And all right. Okay, so this finishes our whistleblowers unit. We just have a few minutes, so we can just sort of start and let me give you a beginning of this next one. I don't think, I'm sorry, I may not have, I have to open up the right file, which I think I may not have. Give me a moment to open the file. Second. Okay, that should be open now. Should be able to get that on the screen. This is good. It gives us an opportunity to look at the beginning of this. Share screen. And it's under there. Okay, good. Okay. Oh, Jack, you have your hand up. Jack, do you have a comment? I see you there, Jack. I see your hand up, but I'm not sure if you're able to unmute your microphone. I'm not sure I can do anything there. Okay. So let us take a look at the beginning. Well, this is just a little introduction. We'll look at this. I like, again, Rabbi Barmash in her book deals with a lot of different issues. This one just really caught my eye because I think it deals with some very important issues having to do with synagogue life. And synagogues are facing more ethical issues. Clergy are. I know the Rabbinical Assembly just recently actually hired a company to come up with some more ethical guidelines. As we know, there's questions of abuse of power in life in general, not just corporate, but nonprofit world as well, has been a major issue, and there have been, unfortunately, some major scandals. Here is an issue of ethics within a synagogue, and the question was brought up in a Reform congregation. Now, in an introduction to this chapter in Rabbi Barmash's book, she brings this text, which I've copied from her book, and you might ask yourself, she's writing a book called Modern Responsa. Modern Responsa meaning the answers to questions that rabbis are writing, and Rabbi Barmash needs to give a little introduction because the Reform movement, one of their principles is that they are not bound by Jewish law, i.e., certainly the other movements feel that Jewish law is still valid, and you have teshuvot that are written by rabbis, individuals, or committees that can be binding. But in the Reform movement, how do you see to it that you balance their idea that individual conscience is supreme versus the rules of Jewish law? So she gives a little, and what we're going to be reading is literally a responsa written by Reform rabbi. And she reminds us, by the middle of the night, the Reform movement began in the early part of the 19th century. By the middle of the 19th century, the Reform movement stopped using responsa written by individual rabbis as a genre of literary expression. Instead, conferences of rabbis decided matters of religious practice by majority vote, a practice other rabbis across the movements would later adapt. Yes, you have the quote Pittsburgh Platform. If you read the history of Reform Judaism in America, there was a conference in Pittsburgh, and the Pittsburgh Platform became a very important statement of Reform movements, practice, and belief. So that, and yes, today, the conservative movement still does have, at its conventions, or at the time of the conventions, they have resolutions that we pass and so on. At that time, Reform rabbis considered rabbinic texts not as guidance, but examples of historic development, and generally did not define law as one of the facets of Judaism, the idea that there was a legal system that everyone was required to follow. However, there was a responsa committee founded in 1906 because some younger rabbis were seeking guidance. Rabbinic leaders thought that the responsa committee of rabbis writing as individuals or small committees would be a way of making their answers less authoritative than CCAR decisions as a whole. So in other words, they said, okay, we have questions, we'll have answers. You don't have to follow them, but at least we're going to give you some guidance. And then she points out that the number of responsa published waxed and waned. Rabbi Solomon Freehoff, well, of course, actually he was in Pittsburgh by coincidence, was one of the great leaders of Reform Judaism in this period after World War II. He gained much prestige and respect from his colleagues for his work on the Committee on Responsa. He published volumes of Reform Responsa. I used to own, before I gave away most of my library, I actually owned a number of his volumes. Why? Not because I said that his positions were authoritative, but I knew that I could read one of his decisions and he would present many of the sources and he would understand where the past was. I would disagree with how he would weigh them, but at least he was a good starting place sometimes to find, frankly, to find sources about different questions. Right, initially concerned ritual matters, but recently about ethical dilemmas, including the following. Okay, so that's the that's the background, and we'll just take a quick look at this ethical dilemma, and then we'll really discuss it in detail in the future. Oh, did I not put it up there? Oh, can you see that the responsa? Is it on your screen? I'm not sure if it is. Do you see who says CCAR responsa? It's there. Okay. CCAR, the Central Committee of American Rabbis. That's the reform equivalent of the Rabbinical Assembly in the conservative movement, the CCAR. So let's just take a look at the question. You think about it over this next week, because it's a somewhat complex question. There are several levels to this question, which is one of the reasons I like it. A young man was sexually molested at a synagogue day camp program by a junior counselor. Okay. The perpetrator was convicted, spent a year in juvenile detention, i.e. this person was a juvenile, and was recently released. Okay. The victim, and we're not clear about the gender. It's irrelevant, the gender of the perpetrator and the victim. The victim's family has gotten a restraining order that prevents the perpetrator from being near the victim's home, school, and synagogue. Okay? But now here's the question. If the judge had not allowed the synagogue to be included in the restraining order, should we have allowed him to attend services or religious school, and under what conditions? So the judge says you can't go by the synagogue. But now the rabbis are saying, this doesn't always happen. What if the judge had said he could go by the synagogue? Should we allow him in? During the hearings, it came out that the perpetrator's mother was aware that her son had previously molested other children, and she had not informed the director of education who was in charge of the program. So her son is now a counselor, and the mother is aware that the son has molested other children. Given this circumstance, is there any reason to deny the mother access to the synagogue? Now, here's a question not about the son, but about the mother. Talk about whistleblowing. Here is a case where she had the opportunity to say, don't hire my son as a counselor at this camp, because I know, based upon his previous behavior, that it's not a good thing for having him around children, right? She could have said that, but did not. The victim's mother, due to her anger, cannot tolerate being in the same place as the perpetrator's mother. To what degree do we as a synagogue follow A, what the judge said, B, what we feel is right, and now we have this whole issue with the mother of the victim and the mother of the perpetrator. Do we have an additional obligation to the mother of the victim, who does not want to be in the presence of the mother of the perpetrator, to prevent the mother of the perpetrator from attending the synagogue? Okay, good time to end. So those are the questions. These are this is not a theoretical question. This was a real question. It's about 20 years ago. Yeah. That's actually the year 50. I guess I'm assuming they number them by Hebrew year, 5765, which is 20 years ago. So that we have a real situation as to how do you deal, and this is, not something that did not happen in any other place, but here's a complicated question of both. Do you just allow the legal authorities what they have said to happen? Do you have a higher responsibility as a synagogue? And what about going beyond the actual individual, but now you have a situation in the synagogue itself where you have someone who does not want to be in the presence of someone else? All right. Is at least the situation clear? I don't want to make light of this. This is a very serious situation. What would be interesting to see, and even though it's Reform rabbis, again, what is interesting often in these cases, which they do bring, and they will, as we will see starting next week, they bring very specific principles from the tradition as to how to deal with the situation. So we'll continue with that next week. And I hope you all are staying warm, having a good day, have a good week, and we'll see you. Heather, did you want to say something or just saying goodbye?
No, I actually want to say something, but you can record. Like you can stop the recording if you
You
want.
want me to stop the recording? Okay, let's see if I can figure that out.